is considered the oldest inhabited, still live within the megalithic ruins of Ollantaytambo. Here, once again, you see the pre-Incan, very inferior Spanish architecture, much more inferior than Incan architecture, that exist within these megalithic foundations all around Ollantaytambo. And a bit of time checking out all the different walkways and buildings that are constructed even to this day, still lived in. Brian Forster called it the oldest inhabited town in the world, many thousands of years. And it is, because you can't carbon date these megalithic stones, but based on the size of them, yes, very, very old. And they surround this royal area. Now, on the approach up to the archaeological site of Ollantaytambo, you start to see some of these very unusual rocks that have these shapes that do not appear to be chiseled. In fact, it looks as if a mason took a trowel and just shaped these forms onto them. So one of the theories that the Resonance Academy was proposing on this trip is that there was a technique, a scientific technique that is only now being understood in our laboratories, but it is this cold plasma technique of rendering matter, including stone, comes out of a quarry, rendering it malleable. So a trowel mark could go over it and create some of these marks you see here, because that's not a chisel mark. That is something that has shaped the stone when it was in a state of being soft. And so these trowel marks may be the key to understanding cold plasma techniques, that they had been able to render these stones soft and then put them in place, and then were able to create such perfect. Also find this cold plasma building technique in Egypt. And here are a couple of examples. Once again, marks, but you see some of these stones being quarried in a softened state, where it appears someone will clay before it is shaped into its desired shape or pattern. Or closely into Pumapunku at Tiwanaku, you do find some of this casting, as well as more of these trowel mark type designs. We're going to hit Pumapunku and Tiwanaku separately here in a little bit, but just to give you some idea that you find this really all around the world in the most ancient sites of the world, this trowel-like cold plasma technique. Well, this is that famous shot of Ollantaytambo that's on a lot of people's news feeds on social media, saying that these are steps of the giants. Well, actually, they're not. They're terraces, very terraces. Here's the steps, people, right there. Brian Forster made the very good point of saying that, hey, all you got to do is throw some potato seeds on these terraces and they'll start growing again. The reason they're so precise and so well built is that this was a royal compound, and all the time a royal compound would be much better fit and designed for the inhabitants there. So that also includes the terraces that were growing their food, which they considered to also be very sacred. Here's Nassim touching some of the walls at Ollantaytambo, no chisel marks. Look at the precise fit. Again, you can see some of the what look like trowel marks on some of the stones there at Ollantaytambo, but also notice the lichen and the growth on the stones. This takes a long, long time for this to happen, and you have examples of it in both of these photos. Vision fits. The most impressive megalith in Ollantaytambo is at the top of the hill, another temple of the sun. These are 20-foot tall and 70-ton slabs, which were quarried over there across the valley at the top of that mountain. You can see in this picture. And there are still some of these 70-ton slabs that are scattered down along the road, and they'd have to get them across the river and get them to the top of the mountain here and dress them and fit them into place. It just seems like a whole lot of work to get these stones from the quarry, which has been found at the top of this mountain, although 1/3 of the way there is no road. It's either eroded away or they had another technique for moving these stones, an as yet discovered scientific technique called auditive levitation, which is matching the matter and rendering it weightless. As I said, this is still an as yet discovered scientific technique. However, auditive levitation on smaller objects has been achieved. There are videos on YouTube where a frog is levitating. It's still alive. It doesn't hurt it. Even a bowling ball. But to have these megalithic slabs moved, well, that's something altogether different. These are massive. And as I said, there are some that are found along the road up to that quarry. They would have had to cross over the Rio Vilcanota River Valley, and that would have been no small feat to get over a fast flowing river and then get them up another mountainside to put them in place here. But if you were able to match the frequency of these stones and render them weightless, then maybe the person doing the moving would just be tapping them along while they were entrained in this vibrational frequency and rendered weightless until they were brought to the location where they're going to be set, and then the vibrational frequency would end, and then the rock would take its weight and size and be put into place. So as we move towards Tiwanaku, this is actually in the Museum of Tiwanaku, including a skull which had been found there, an elongated skull, but is not on display. This is kind of interesting because in Bolivia, where Tiwanaku is, you have these explanations of cranium deformation and how you can wrap a skull. And it's true, you can wrap a skull and you can make different shapes in it, as you can see here. But one thing you cannot do with cranial deformation is actually increase the size of the skull. 30% larger in some cases. These elongated skulls are larger than our own. So while they make an attempt to say it's all part of wrapping and putting things on the head, especially children, I mean, we still see it in Natural Geographic. Children in Africa today have cranial deformations, but to increase the cranial size by 30% is actually impossible. Well, it was known that the Incan royal class would shape their skulls. Another theory that we were talking about on this trip was that perhaps the Incans were modeling themselves after the elongated people who once inhabited and created the great megaliths of South America. It's known that the Incans came into these cities like Cuzco and Ollantaytambo and even Tiwanaku and just adapted cultures and their designs to the South American cities themselves. And so it wouldn't be much of a stretch to say that they also modeled themselves after these elongated skull ancestors, the original inhabitants that created South America. So now you can see here quite clearly a human skull next to an elongated skull with that 30% larger cranial capacity. You cannot wrap a skull that small to create that much more volume. It's just impossible. So these elongated skulls, and I do cover this in my upcoming book called Beyond Esoteric, in a chapter called Suppressed Human Origins, going into the whole notion that there were these very human-like, but not quite human, entities that once lived on Earth. And slowly, science is catching up. You have the Boskop skull in South Africa, which is a 30% larger cranium than humans, has been found and discussed in the magazine Nature. And you have a museum in Paracas, Peru, that quite proudly presents these elongated skulls, some of them even with hair on them. But you can see here how much larger they are. And then there's quite a few things that are not quite the same, and that is that you have no sutures, no cranial sutures that go up through the skull itself, which we have on our human skulls. Not the same for the Paracas skulls. You have other features, of course, the size and other smaller nuances that suggest these are just not humans as we know ourselves to be today. And finally, a larger skull would mean a larger being. So these elongated skulls could very well be giants. They could have these skulls that extend much larger in full growth. Now, this is a little baby that was discovered by Renato Reclime, and he calls it the Wakui. This is an actual ET alien, and that's what Wakui means in his book. And he has a museum in the Sacred Valley that we got a chance to go visit, and he showed it to us. It's right there on display. And the head is as large as the torso. That's how big these heads are. Presuming this would grow to full size, it would be rather large. And there it is on display. This particular skeleton was ritualistically killed. It had a blow mark in the back of the skull. That's how it died. It was intentionally killed, but it was buried in a royal tomb up above the Sacred Valley that we could see from the bottom of the valley floor up to where it was discovered, lying in rest next to ancient Incan. Be a very unusual and sacred person to be buried in the same fashion, mummified in the same way, wrapped and buried as they would be. So others have been found as well, these elongated body skulls. This is a place called Huaytara, which is also displayed in Ande Huapas. That's where the previous Waikui is on display. So the Peruvians are much more open to the idea that these are just different from humans. And they will put them on display in museums. As I mentioned, the Paracas Museum, Ande Huapas, and other smaller museums are starting to display them because they continuously are found. And this is quite remarkable because it's not like a one-off. It's a whole civilization that had existed. And you can imagine a lot of these have been destroyed or looted from their graves. It's only because there were so many of them and they continue to be found that we have such a good record of them now. You can see how this is mummified. The fingers are curled up, still in its own skin. The hair and the eyes, the soft tissue is gone. The technique of mummification were clearly at hand, and these mummies show it. Some of these elongated skulls have been found up at Lake Titicaca as well, because not far off the shoreline is Tiwanaku on the Bolivia side. Lake Titicaca is the largest alpine lake in the world. It extends 100 miles at the longest point. It's huge. It's an ancient volcanic caldera, which has collapsed and filled with water over a long, long period of time, much like our Crater Lake here in Oregon, equally as deep and very, very large. This one, it takes hours to cross. It's so big. And there are many islands in there. It's about 70% on the Peruvian side and about 30% on the Bolivian side. This is on one of the Peruvian islands. I was thinking at the time I took this photo, it's got to be one of the highest elevation beaches in the world. What a place to get a suntan. And yeah, the sun is really intense there. It has freshwater seahorses, and that happens in no other freshwater lake in the world. But here it is at Lake Titicaca, which could have rose from the ocean. And as the seawater slowly became freshwater, these seahorses adapted and remain in Lake Titicaca to this day. 12,000 feet up. Also just off of the shore of Lake Titicaca is this mysterious doorway, the Amaru Meru, a reported Stargate. I was reading about it in our Lonely Planet book. Even in Lonely Planet, they're saying that there are tourists who have gone missing here, that this is a very unusual site, that it's not recommended to go here at night and things like this, or other stories of travelers who are with their friends and the group is around the corner and one person goes off to the doorway here and they never see him again. Couldn't find him, sent out a search party, gone. So all kinds of strange things around the shoreline of Lake Titicaca, as well as many other megalithic ruins. I showed you some of those round towers earlier, and this is what it looks like as the country of Bolivia, highlighted here, Lake Titicaca up on the upper left, the approximate border, kind of like that, cuts off, shaves off 70% on the Peruvian side, 30% on the Bolivian side. And here you can see the high altiplano, including the Salar de Uyuni, which we'll get to in a minute, but how Bolivia drops off into the Amazon rainforest. Much of the country is rainforest, and people go here for ayahuasca ceremony and to experience the Amazon rainforest, where it's so hot and humid down there, whereas up on the altiplano, it's quite dry and desert-like. Again, a resurgency of Indian lore. This is the emergence point of the legendary god Viracocha, who arose from Lake Titicaca and then went to Tiwanaku, to create the first. And this is a really cool town called Copacabana. Spent about a week here, just never really wanted to leave. It was so much fun and such a beautiful little place. Hang out, cool people, lots to see and do. And this is where you catch boat tours to some of the islands in Lake Titicaca, including this one, the Island of the Sun. This is an actual reproduction of one of the reed boats that was recreated and still used for ceremony. It was docked right here where our boat came in from Copacabana, which is just around the corner here. It was about an hour boat ride to get here, and this is our little cabana hotel room. And one day we started to explore around the island, found this cool reproductive of a Incan boat. But most people come to Island of the Sun, just as they've done since times of antiquity, to experience these ruins. And this was the actual emergence point itself, called the Pilco Kamiya. And again, this is another temple of the sun, not in the best state of preservation. I think it's been mostly rebuilt. There are some other megalithic sites around the Island of the Sun which are in a better state of preservation. But it would be to come up here to the highest point of the Island of the Sun to look out at this fantastic panorama surrounding the island. And then off in the distance here, lit up in the sun, this is the Island of the Moon. So another common feature you'd find among Incan sites are sometimes you have a male and a female side to things. The Island of the Sun is very masculine, very angular, very large, compared to the Island of the Moon, which is the female version. And here in this Incan nunnery, goddess Mama Kila resides. Still to this day, there are altars and ritualistic offerings to Mama Kila, still very much in the interest of the post-Incan people who continue to come to this site in high reverence for Mama Kila. This is the sunset over Lake Titicaca, quite dramatic. See how beautiful it is. You're so high up. You're at 12,500 foot elevation. It just feels like you're on the roof of the world here. As you can see, the clouds almost seem to sink below the horizon because you're so far up. And as I mentioned, on the Bolivian side is the very enigmatic city of Tiwanaku. This being the Sun Gate doorway, carved from a massive single slab of andesite, a real hard stone. And there is the sun god himself. This stone cracked in an earthquake, and there are old images of it showing it intact. So the earthquake was fairly recent. One of the most interesting places in Tiwanaku I felt was the semi-subterranean temple at Tiwanaku. And it,
we are in the
there's a little video I shot.
Semi-subterranean temple at Tiwanaku, one of the most famous and photographed locations of this pre-Inca temple and political complex, with these very enigmatic faces, where all but 6 are originals. Some look like skulls, some look like aliens with bug eyes. Maybe they were the priestly caste, maybe they were royalty, maybe they were people that lived here, that worshipped here, or maybe they were something altogether different. Here's these white ones are the artificial ones, where all the rest are originals, according to the placard just above. Now, when this temple was discovered, these walls were all in a jumbled mess, including these heads. And some archaeologists, like Brian Forrester, think that it was assembled in a different way than it was originally, and therefore thinks that perhaps this particular site shouldn't be represented in the way it was. But what's the alternative? Leaving it in a jumbled mess, or giving us an opportunity to see it in its semi-reconstructed state? Now, this was also the location where they found the Pachamama monolith, which is now in the museum, 7.3 meters tall. And these monoliths were also found here and remain here. See the serpent going up the side, and the hands holding ritual objects, and the long ears, similar to Easter Island. Quite a fascinating sight. Semi-subterranean temple at Tiwanaku.
So that's really interesting to note. The hand position over the bellies, holding ritual objects, the heads themselves, which often have this headgear, and then these very, very large bulbous eyes. So we'll take a tour into the museum to see some of these statues that I mentioned. But just 1 mile away, people need to know that is this site of Pumapunku. And the very famous George Squire, who did all the mapping and drawings of the mound sites in North America. And he was one of the first scientists from the USA to do measurements and check out some of these megaliths and do these drawings from 1877. So this site of Pumapunku, which is really part of Tiwanaku, it's just separated by only a mile, is really the crown jewel of Tiwanaku, because it has these very, very exactly carved stones and drill holes and keystones and massive megaliths you can see here that remain scattered around the site. So it does appear that Tiwanaku and Pumapunku experienced a very large earthquake that just threw apart the Tiwanaku temple like a Lego set after disruption. So these are the famous H stones. These are very, very difficult to cut because of the precise right angle, and then the inner cuts within more inner cuts. And they are some of the prime examples of the high culture and engineering prowess of the pre-Incan people. And it should be pointed out that the Pumapunku and Tiwanaku are the only sites in South America that are acknowledged by everyone to be pre-Incan sites. There's still some dispute whether the megaliths in Peru and elsewhere were pre-Incan, but this, everybody says somebody before them had this technology. And here you can see some of the indents into this hard andesite rock, which again are very difficult to make. Cuts inside of cuts at such precise right angles. This is what the Pumapunku temple would have looked like. It's recently been recreated using all the stones that remain to this day and finding the most logical places where they would have gone. Wouldn't have been that large, but so precisely cut that it would have been a very sacred location to the pre-Incan people who built it. Here we can see some of those T-cuts. So these would have held metal to the metallists together. That also shows a level of sophistication really unrivaled and unmatched at even modern building sites today. Again, why would they need to go so big? What was the point of going megalithic? In this case, cyclopean architecture, as if they were built by giants, or as if they were holding some kind of secrets as far as how did they have the technology to build this, that we're still playing catch up to try to understand why these are so big and massive and how they made such precise cuts.